I never thought I'd feel this drawn to my friend's mom, until she whispered, "You don't know how hard it is to stay away." It was a quiet Saturday afternoon when I found myself at my friend's house, the kind of visit that was meant to be casual, homework, some snacks, maybe a game, but ended up feeling like stepping into a space that existed slightly outside the usual rhythm of my life. His mom was there, as always, moving through the kitchen with effortless grace. She was in her early 40s, her presence calm but magnetic, her movements precise yet unhurried. The sunlight from the tall window caught her hair at just the right angle, and for a moment, I couldn't look away. I was carrying a stack of books and papers, fumbling slightly, when one slipped and tumbled toward the floor. She bent down to pick it up, her fingers brushing against mine in the process. It was brief, a flash of contact, but enough to make my chest tighten unexpectedly. Her hand was warm, and I could feel a subtle pulse, a quiet steadiness that seemed to anchor me in the moment. I stammered a thank you, which she met with a soft, knowing smile. That smile had an easy confidence, but there was also something quieter behind it, a hint of vulnerability that made me want to understand her better. She handed the books back, and our fingers lingered for a fraction longer than necessary. I quickly pulled my hand away, but the warmth stayed, almost as if it had seeped into my skin. I tried to focus on my friend, who was oblivious to the subtle tension in the room, but I couldn't shake the awareness of her presence. She moved past me with the faintest sway of her hips, the scent of her perfume, floral, soft, not overpowering, hanging in the air long after she had gone. We exchanged a few words about the weather, about my friend's plans, but each sentence carried an unspoken weight. I noticed the way she tilted her head slightly when listening, the way her eyes seemed to look at me a second longer than necessary, and the gentle way she adjusted her sleeve. Every small gesture was amplified in my mind, like I was suddenly hyper-aware of her existence. There was a quiet intimacy in the ordinary moment, an accidental brush of hands, a shared glance across the room, that made my heart feel a little off-kilter. I caught myself wondering what it would feel like to linger in that space longer, to let the moment stretch just a little. And though I knew I shouldn't, I couldn't help noticing the subtle pull between us, the tiny spark of curiosity that neither of us seemed ready to acknowledge out loud. By the time I left that afternoon, the encounter had settled into my thoughts, like sunlight caught in a jar, warm, soft, and impossible to ignore. I didn't understand it fully yet, but I knew something had shifted. It wasn't just admiration or politeness, it was something more tender, more complicated. And somewhere deep down, I realized that the rest of this summer, or maybe even longer, would be shaped by moments like this, quiet, fleeting, and impossibly alive. The following weeks brought more visits, each one innocuous on the surface but quietly charged beneath. At first, I told myself it was coincidence, helping my friend with homework, dropping by for a quick chat, grabbing a soda from the fridge, but slowly, the routine became a rhythm I couldn't ignore. His mom was always there, moving through her home with that same effortless grace, and each time she crossed my path, I felt it, a subtle pull, like an undercurrent beneath calm waters. One afternoon, I helped her carry groceries from the car to the kitchen. Our hands brushed repeatedly as we lifted bags and reached for cans. Each contact lingered just a fraction too long, and I could feel a warmth spreading through my chest, a quiet awareness of her presence that made ordinary tasks feel suddenly intimate. She laughed softly at my clumsiness when a bag tilted, and it wasn't just the sound of her laughter, it was the way her eyes crinkled at the corners, the slight curve of her lips, the small gesture of brushing her hair behind her ear. Everything about her seemed deliberate yet unstudied, and I found myself watching her with a mixture of fascination and hesitation. Even small moments carried weight. While setting the table, I noticed how her fingers traced the edge of a plate absent-mindedly, how she adjusted a napkin with careful precision. There was a grace to her movements that I couldn't replicate, and it drew me in, making me hyper-aware of the space we shared. At one point, I reached for the same dish she did, and our hands met. We paused, just for a heartbeat, and then both smiled, that brief moment lingering longer in memory than the task at hand. There were also quiet, unplanned instances of closeness. Sitting side by side to help my friend with an assignment, I felt the warmth of her shoulder brushing against mine. A strand of her hair fell across her face, and instinctively, I tucked it behind her ear. She didn't pull away. Instead, she glanced at me, her gaze soft but loaded with something unspoken. I sensed a tension, familiar yet strange, stretching across the small space between us. It was subtle, almost imperceptible to anyone else, but to me, it was electric. Her presence became a constant in my thoughts. I caught myself replaying our interactions, the brush of her hand, the tilt of her head, the warmth of her smile, over and over, analyzing every pause, every fleeting glance. It was confusing, exhilarating, and slightly terrifying. I wasn't supposed to feel this way, but I couldn't deny it. By the end of one particularly quiet evening, as she handed me a mug of steaming tea, our fingers touched again. The warmth lingered, and in that instant, I understood the growing awareness between us. It wasn't just attraction, it was recognition. Recognition of a bond neither of us fully understood yet, a connection quietly unfolding in ordinary moments, in touches that were brief but meaningful, and in glances that said more than words ever could. From that day on, the simple visits weren't simple anymore. They were charged with possibility, tension, and the slow, unmistakable pull of something forbidden yet profoundly human. And somewhere in the back of my mind, I knew that this was only the beginning. It was one of those evenings where the world outside felt muted, the sky a soft gray, and the distant hum of traffic seemed far away. My friend was out running errands, leaving the house quiet except for the gentle creak of floorboards and the soft ticking of a wall clock. I was sitting at the kitchen table, pretending to focus on a book, when she appeared with 2 mugs of tea. The steam curled upward, carrying with it the subtle scent of chamomile and something uniquely hers, a warm, comforting fragrance that seemed to settle around me. "Thought you might like a break," she said softly, placing the mug in front of me. Her hand lingered on the edge of the table, brushing against mine as she withdrew. I felt a sudden warmth, a quiet thrill that made my chest tighten. I glanced up, and our eyes met. There was a weight there, something unspoken, and for a moment neither of us spoke. Instead, we simply existed in the space, the quiet hum of the house accentuating every subtle gesture. She moved to the counter, stirring her own tea slowly, and I noticed the slight tension in her shoulders, the gentle tilt of her head as if she were gathering her thoughts. Then, almost without warning, she began speaking, not about anything important, really, but about the small frustrations of adult life. Bills, responsibilities, the loneliness that sometimes crept in despite a busy schedule. Her voice was calm, but there was a tremor beneath it, a vulnerability that surprised me. "I don't know," she admitted quietly, "sometimes it just feels heavy. Even when everything looks fine from the outside." She took a sip of tea, her fingers wrapped loosely around the mug, and I found myself noticing how the warmth seemed to radiate through her palms. I wanted to say something, anything, to ease the weight she carried, but the right words didn't come. Instead, I simply leaned forward slightly, letting my shoulder brush hers in a gesture of quiet solidarity. She glanced at me then, her eyes softening. It was the kind of look that felt like a confession without words, an acknowledgement that she was allowing me into a space few others ever saw. I felt an unfamiliar mixture of protectiveness and longing, a sense that this moment was fragile and fleeting, yet deeply significant. We sat like that for several minutes, neither speaking, yet communicating in ways that went beyond words. Every small touch, the brush of her hand, the tilt of her shoulder, the shared warmth of the mugs, was amplified in my awareness. I could feel her heartbeat in subtle rhythms, the quiet steadiness that mirrored my own rising pulse. For the first time, I realized just how complicated these feelings were. It wasn't just attraction, it was admiration, tenderness, and a deep emotional resonance that made even the simplest gestures feel electric. I was drawn in by her presence, by the unspoken vulnerability she offered, and by the quiet intimacy that was slowly building between us. When she finally excused herself to check on something in the other room, I was left with the lingering warmth of her hand on mine, the memory of her gaze, and the undeniable sense that something had shifted. That evening didn't end with a declaration, but it didn't need to. In the quiet, in the stolen touches and shared silences, we had already begun to understand each other, and, perhaps, ourselves, better than ever before. It was one of those quiet evenings that felt suspended in time. My friend had gone out with classmates, leaving just the two of us in the living room. The soft hum of the ceiling fan mixed with the occasional distant sound of cars outside, creating a cocoon of stillness. I found myself sitting on the couch, half reading a book, but my attention kept drifting to her. She moved around the room with that same effortless grace, tidying a few things, her presence filling the space in a way I could feel even when she wasn't directly in front of me. At one point, she bent down to retrieve something from the low shelf, and I instinctively leaned forward to help. Our hands met as we reached for the same book, and we froze for a heartbeat, the contact lingering just long enough for me to feel a warmth radiate through my palm. She looked up, eyes locking with mine, and for a second, everything else seemed to fade, the hum of the fan, the muted light of the room, even the ticking of the clock. I felt a quickening in my chest, the kind that makes you acutely aware of your own heartbeat. We exchanged a few words, almost mundane in nature, but each syllable seemed weighted. Her voice was softer, slower, as if she were measuring each sound, and I found myself leaning slightly closer without realizing it. When she moved past me, our shoulders brushed, again, a subtle, fleeting contact that made the air between us feel charged. I couldn't tell if she felt it too, but I sensed her hesitation, the tiny pause in her step that suggested an awareness of something unspoken. Later, we settled near the window, the soft golden light of the setting sun spilling across the room. She picked up a cup of tea, and I noticed the way her fingers curled around it, the quiet steadiness in her movements, and the faint warmth that seemed to radiate from her touch. I reached out, almost absent-mindedly, to adjust a blanket draped over the couch, and my hand brushed hers again. The touch was brief, but the electricity lingered, a subtle acknowledgement of the tension that had been building between us for weeks. Neither of us spoke about it. There was no confession, no overt action, just a series of small, intimate gestures, the way she tilted her head when listening, the faint smile that played across her lips, the soft inhale she drew when our hands met. Every movement was amplified in my mind, every glance weighted with unspoken meaning. I felt both exhilarated and anxious, caught in the delicate balance of desire and propriety. By the time she excused herself to check on something in the kitchen, I was left with a heightened awareness of her absence, my senses attuned to the lingering trace of her perfume and the warmth of her previous touch. That evening didn't change anything outwardly, but it deepened something intangible, an unspoken acknowledgement that the space between us was charged, fragile, and full of possibility. It was a tension neither of us could name aloud, yet impossible to ignore. And as I sat there, letting the quiet settle around me, I realized that every small touch, every fleeting glance, was drawing us closer, step by careful step, towards something neither of us was yet ready to define. It was late evening, and the house had quieted down completely. My friend had gone to bed early, leaving just the two of us in the living room. The soft amber glow of the lamp cast gentle shadows across the walls, highlighting the familiar lines of her face, the subtle creases around her eyes when she smiled, the graceful curve of her jaw, the warmth that seemed to radiate from her presence. I was sitting on the couch, and she perched on the armrest nearby, a mug of tea balanced carefully in her hands. The silence between us wasn't awkward, it was expectant, as though the air itself was holding its breath. I don't know how to say this, she began softly, her voice catching slightly. I felt my chest tighten, a strange mix of anticipation and anxiety twisting in my stomach. She paused, taking a slow sip of her tea, fingers tracing the rim of the mug. Her eyes met mine, steady and vulnerable at once. And then, she whispered the words that would linger with me forever, "You don't know how hard it is to stay away." Her confession hung in the air like fragile glass. My heart thudded audibly in my chest, and for a moment, I couldn't move or speak. The warmth of her presence was overwhelming, the quiet intensity of her gaze, the soft rise and fall of her chest as she sipped her tea, the subtle scent of her perfume drifting toward me. I wanted to reach out, to close the distance between us, but I hesitated, aware of the fragile line we were treading. We sat like that for a long while, neither of us speaking, yet the connection between us felt tangible, almost electric. Her hand brushed against mine as she set the mug down, and I felt a jolt of awareness, soft, intimate, and undeniable. It wasn't just the physical contact, it was the vulnerability she allowed me to witness, the honesty that laid bare something I had long suspected but had never dared to name. I could see it in the way her shoulders relaxed slightly after she spoke, as if the words themselves were a release. She looked smaller somehow, yet infinitely more human, and I felt an overwhelming urge to protect her, to comfort her, and to honor the trust she had placed in me. I shifted slightly, letting my shoulder touch hers in a gesture of quiet reassurance. She didn't pull away, instead, her eyes softened further, and I could feel the unspoken acknowledgement of the bond we were forging. For the first time, the pull I had felt for weeks transformed into something more profound. It was no longer just curiosity or fleeting attraction, it was recognition, emotional intimacy, and a tentative permission to exist closer than social propriety might allow. Every glance, every subtle touch, carried a weight I could feel in my chest. When she finally rose to refill her mug, I watched her go, my mind replaying the confession over and over. That single sentence, uttered softly, almost shyly, had shifted everything between us. I realized then that our connection was no longer incidental, it was real, tender, and irrevocably significant. And though neither of us said it aloud, we both understood, the next steps we took would change everything, for better or worse, in ways neither of us could yet predict. The days after her confession carried a different rhythm. The house felt alive with unspoken possibilities, yet neither of us rushed. Every interaction was measured, small gestures amplified by the knowledge that something delicate had shifted between us. It wasn't a sudden leap into intimacy, it was a careful exploration, a dance of glances, touches, and shared moments that felt weighted with meaning. One afternoon, we found ourselves cooking together in the kitchen. She stood beside me at the counter, her movements fluid as she chopped vegetables. When I reached for the same knife to dice a carrot, our hands met briefly. The touch was fleeting, but my fingers tingled long after. She didn't pull away, instead, she gave a small, almost imperceptible smile, and I felt a warmth spreading through my chest. Our conversation was light, playful even, but beneath the words, an undercurrent of connection ran strong. Later, as we cleaned the counter together, our knees brushed. It was accidental, or perhaps not, but neither of us moved away. I felt the softness of her sweater against my leg, the warmth of her presence almost tangible, and a quiet awareness settled between us. There was no need for words, the touch itself spoke volumes. I could feel her heartbeat echoing softly in the space between us, matching the quickening rhythm of my own. We also began sharing quieter, more intimate moments that weren't defined by touch alone. Sitting side by side on the couch, reading or scrolling through our phones, we would lean just a little closer, shoulders brushing, sometimes reaching for the same blanket. There was a comfort in these small gestures, a sense that we were testing the waters of intimacy without forcing anything, without speaking aloud the emotions that hovered just beneath the surface. Even in silence, our connection deepened. I noticed the way her gaze lingered a moment longer than necessary, the subtle tilt of her head when she listened to me, the soft exhale she let slip when she relaxed near me. Every movement, every glance, was amplified by the awareness of what had been confessed, and each interaction carried the delicious tension of restraint. One evening, she rested her hand on mine while we reached for the same mug of tea. The warmth of her palm was comforting, grounding, and yet electric, a silent acknowledgement of the growing closeness between us. I hesitated, savoring the feeling, aware that each touch was significant, and she didn't withdraw either. It was a tentative permission to be near, to share the space safely, without crossing boundaries we both understood. By the end of these days, it was clear, our connection had evolved. It was no longer merely attraction or curiosity, it was emotional intimacy, slowly solidifying in the rhythm of shared spaces, gentle touches, and quiet glances. Neither of us knew exactly where this path would lead, but the tentative steps we were taking felt right, respectful, and profoundly human. Every day brought new moments of closeness, small gestures that spoke louder than words. And in each one, I felt the slow, undeniable pull of something deeper, a connection built on trust, subtle desire, and the shared courage to explore what had once been forbidden, carefully, quietly, and beautifully. It was a quiet Sunday morning, the kind where sunlight spills softly through the curtains and the world seems to pause just long enough for small, meaningful moments to unfold. My friend had gone out for a while, giving us the house to ourselves. We found ourselves sitting near the window, a shared blanket draped loosely over our shoulders. The warmth of her presence pressed gently against mine, comforting yet thrilling in its familiarity. I could feel the faint brush of her hair against my arm as she shifted slightly, and the subtle rise and fall of her chest as she breathed. We didn't speak at first. Words felt unnecessary in the gentle intimacy that had grown between us. Her hand found mine, fingers curling naturally around mine, a touch that was at once tender and deliberate. I could feel the warmth radiating from her palm, the quiet pulse beneath her skin that matched the rhythm of my own. In that moment, the weeks of small gestures, lingering glances, and hesitant touches crystallized into something undeniable. "I'm glad we can just be like this," she murmured softly, her voice carrying a mixture of relief and vulnerability. Her thumb traced gentle circles along the back of my hand, a subtle, comforting motion that made my chest tighten with quiet happiness. I nodded, not trusting my voice, letting the warmth of her hand and the softness of her gaze convey everything I felt. We shifted slightly, leaning closer until our shoulders pressed together. There was no rush, no expectation, just a shared understanding that we had arrived at a place of mutual trust and affection. Every brush of skin, every slight movement, was loaded with the intimacy we had cultivated carefully over weeks. The age difference, the social boundaries, the unspoken challenges, they existed, yes, but in that quiet morning, they felt less significant than the simple truth of our connection. At one point, she rested her head lightly against my shoulder, a gesture so subtle yet so meaningful that I felt my heart swell. I lowered my cheek to the top of her head, letting the softness of her hair brush against my face. The warmth of her body, the quiet steadiness of her breathing, and the shared silence created a cocoon of comfort that felt complete, satisfying, and right. We stayed like that for a long while, simply sharing space, savoring the slow rhythm of togetherness that didn't need words to be understood. Even small movements, the intertwining of fingers, the occasional shift closer, the faint laugh that escaped in response to nothing at all, felt profound. Every gesture, no matter how slight, was an acknowledgement of the bond we had nurtured, a bond that was now steady, mutual, and safe. As sunlight streamed fully into the room, bathing us in warmth, I realized that the tension, the hesitation, and the uncertainty of the past weeks had culminated in this quiet fulfillment. There was no dramatic confession needed, no grand declaration. The intimacy we had built, through touches, glances, and shared vulnerability, was enough. And in that soft morning light, with her warmth pressed against me and our fingers intertwined, I understood that some connections, carefully nurtured and respectfully approached, could feel both forbidden and entirely right at the same time. If this story made your heart skip a beat or reminded you of a connection you felt but never named, hit like and subscribe to join me for more slow burn, heartfelt romance stories. And share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear which moments made you feel the most.